and thank you for joining us today for this NZLS CLE webinar, Unconscious Bias, Inclusiveness in Action. My name is Alex Jarman, and I'm today's moderator. Our presenter today is Carol Brown from Auckland. The runtime for this webinar is 1.5 hours, including time at the end for questions. There will be no break in the webinar, but if you need to pop out during the broadcast, you'll be able to catch up on missed parts via the archive copy. At the end of the webinar, I will tell you how to access the archive. You will already have received an email from CLE with a copy of the PowerPoints to be used today. Your microphones are muted during the presentation, so background noises don't interfere with the webinar broadcast. We encourage you to participate in the webinar by sending in questions during the broadcast, and now I will explain how to do this. You should now see the webinar toolbar slide. If your control panel is a small box on the right-hand side of your screen with 3 icons going down, click on the orange arrow to expand your control panel to full size. Now that your control panel is expanded, you can use the orange button to show or hide that control panel as you wish. If you'd like to permanently show the expanded control panel, you'll see 3 menu options on the top right of your screen. Click on the View menu. On the drop-down menu, make sure that the Auto Hide Control Panel option is unticked. To ask questions during the webinar, you'll need to enter your questions into the area near the bottom of your control panel called Enter a Question for Staff. Carol will answer as many questions as time allows. Thank you once again for joining us today, and I'll now pass you over to Carol.
Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. Thanks, Alex, for the introduction. And thank you for taking the time to dial in and to participate in this unconscious bias training session. A little bit about Diversitas, which is the organisation I'm representing. We are a consulting company, and we work with organisations across New Zealand and Australia to help them leverage the benefit of having a diverse workforce and to create inclusive work practices. Having a look at the attendance list, many of you are already familiar with Diversitas, and we've already worked with you. But for those who are not familiar with us, we have the series of in-action training precisely to deal with some of the opportunities that having a diverse workforce can bring, but also to highlight how unconscious bias decision-making can negatively impact our workplaces and undermine a culture of inclusiveness. So delighted to have you on the call. What we're going to cover off today is an abridged version of what we would normally do in a full training session. So there's quite a lot to cover off, and apologies if it's quite theory heavy, but we will go through it, and as Alex says, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions. What we're going to cover off today is really understanding how biases are formed from a very young age, looking at how you have insight into the development of your own biases, then looking at why these matter and what's happening in the workforce that will really impact how we approach decisions in the workplace, and finally be able to implement some strategies on how you might come to overcome some of your unconscious bias decision making. So, without further ado, let's move on to what a bias is. So, much has been said lately in the press and in a whole lot of research papers around bias, and there's a lot of talk in organisations around how bias can impact decisions. And the first thing I really want to call your attention to is that bias is nothing more than just a predetermined preference towards a situation or an individual or towards particular behaviours. And it's something that is incredibly natural, and it's part of the human condition. We all have predetermined preferences. Some of these are very, very conscious. So when you think about a conscious bias that you might have in the workplace, when you're recruiting graduates into a role, you might have a preference for graduates who have a particular qualification or who have achieved particular grades. And that's a very conscious decision you're making. And you have set a standard in your organization, and that's the standard that you want to achieve. And so from that perspective, it's a very conscious bias. Conscious because you're aware of it, everyone else is aware of it, and you quite openly talk about it. You might also have, as an individual, a conscious bias which is not so positively received. So, for example, you might have a bias that inclines you towards employing younger people rather than older people. Now, this is a bias that probably isn't as accepted in the general workplace, and it's probably something that your policies might prohibit. So you might have an EEO policy in your organization that says we don't discriminate on age, we don't discriminate on gender, and so forth. But you, as a hiring manager, you might have a preference for younger people because you might at one point have employed an older person, and that didn't work out. And so that is a conscious preference that you have. Of course, it's something you might not want to share with your colleagues. And you might find that that sort of conscious bias will be generally frowned upon, and your colleagues might actually call you up on that. So we have a whole lot of conscious biases that we apply and operate to in our workplace, and it's really important to understand that. When it comes to unconscious bias, we are unaware of our prejudice or preference, and we really believe that we're acting objectively and fairly. And it's really important to understand that a bias has an impact of favoring one group or person, and at the same time prejudicing another. So it has a double impact. At the unconscious level, as I said, we are completely unaware of it, and as such, we really operate on the basis that other people think the way we do or feel the way we do towards a particular issue, and of course that's just not true. So where our unconscious biases play out, we really believe we're acting objectively, and it really can result in giving more interesting work to one group as opposed to another group, or it can result in giving more favorable performance ratings to one individual over another, and so on. And we all believe that we are acting objectively and fairly. So your policies that you have in your organization no doubt support that sort of behavior, and very few of us sort of leap out of bed in the morning and decide that we're going to act in a discriminatory way. So unconscious biases can be really, really detrimental because, first of all, they're not acknowledged, and secondly, they are very insidious. So they have a very negative effect on the people who they're prejudicing, and it's very difficult for people to pinpoint what that is. And there's also very often no legal recourse because it's really only felt by the person being impacted. The group of people or the individual who's being preferenced will not see the bias. They will not even be aware of it. So it really is, the unconscious bias is really what is hampering a lot of the decision making in the workforce. When we look at the research on the impact of unconscious bias in the workplace, it plays out in so many dimensions. And you have the workbook that you've been provided with, and there's a lot of material in the workbook and a lot of reference material as well. So feel free to reference this after the session. We won't cover everything off in the session, but it makes interesting reading. So issues like the influence of physical appearance in the labour market. We know from research that more attractive people get paid more, get promoted more, and so on. And we see this playing out in a number of studies that have been done over many, many years. Tall people receive a pay premium. Men often get most of the critical assignments, more critical assignments than women do. And very often we see this benevolent sexism bias play out, where we see that women are rated more highly than men in certain aspects, and yet fewer women are selected for promotion and for advancement in their careers. So it plays out across many, many dimensions. And of course, all of these have an ultimate effect on how not just women, but any minority group progresses in the workforce. It's really important to call out as well that bias doesn't just play out in the gender arena, although it is actually very easy to study how bias does impact gender, and therefore a lot of research has been done on it. But bias plays out equally across minority groups from an ethnic perspective, from an age perspective, and so on. So really important to understand that, and more difficult to find research that bears that out, but nevertheless just as prevalent. Because women are generally the biggest minority group in the workplace, a lot of the focus has been on this. So if bias is just a predetermined viewpoint and part of the human condition, which it is, the next question we have to ask is, where do these predetermined viewpoints come from? And how are they formed? And this takes us to the next slide, where we look at the diversity dimension wheel. This is a very useful model where we can begin to understand how this plays out in human behavior. So if we look at the center of the circle, that blue area called personality, this really reflects the fact that we are all born with a unique personality type. And our personality is influenced by all of those external dimensions that sit around it, and how we progress in life also impacts how our personality forms. So the personality is sort of the core. As a child grows up, and even at a very, very young age, you look at those internal dimensions, the green ring that sits around the personality, you can go up to a small child and ask them how old they are, and they'll be able to tell you that they're 2 or 3 years old. And the question is, how do they know that? Well, somebody in their short little life has gone to them and said to them, you are 2. And for the first time in that child's life, they start to realize that age is a thing, it's a dimension. And they start to define themselves and others by some of those dimensions. So they can see immediately that 2 is not the same as 4. And my parents are older than me, and that age then means ability. And ability reflects what you can and can't do, and what you are allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do, and so on. And so for the first time, the child is starting to understand where they fit in the grand scheme of life. The same applies to the dimension of age and of gender and sexual orientation and physical ability and so on. So a child soon starts to realize that they are a different gender to the next person, that they look different, that their parents might look different, and at once they start to identify themselves and others in terms of these dimensions and start to understand, who do I belong to? Which is the group that I belong to? Which is the group that I relate to? When we move to the external dimensions, that red ring that sits around the next layer, we look at the more social dimensions by which we define ourselves and others. So you can see their marital status, income, personal habits, work experience, and so forth. And when you look at this red ring, these are the characteristics by which you probably define many of your social connections. So many of the friendships that you have in life and the social connections you have will share your values in terms of these dimensions. So it plays out really strongly, and we see this, right across the globe. It's the reason why people from a particular country will move to New Zealand and then settle in a suburb where there are other people like them. So they've moved across the world, but they come to New Zealand and they choose to be with people who come from where they come from. And it's this very, very strong affinity bias that we have, which means that we are constantly looking for what is like us, because we can understand that, we can relate to it, and makes us feel safe, and we are drawn to it. There was a very interesting experiment done with a cohort of Chinese students who were English language students, and they were sent to university in London to improve their English language skills. And their English language capability was tested before they left. And after 6 months, they went back to China and they were retested. And their language ability dropped by 40%. And the reason, of course, is that as soon as they got into an unfamiliar environment, they bunkered down and chose to speak Chinese. And of course, this is just human behavior. This is what happens. We see it play out across the world. But very important to understand that we are innately wired for that. So it's a very natural behavior when we are feeling threatened or in an unfamiliar environment. Obviously not an experiment that they would probably want to repeat. The final dimension that we'll look at is the organizational dimension. And here we look at issues such as the work content or the field that you work in, your seniority, your work location, and so forth. And although organizations of today are really starting to flatten out and starting to become much more collaborative and consultative and less hierarchical, we still tend to define ourselves by some of these dimensions. So, we work with organizations who have their executive on a particular level in a building. And talking about that level 5 or whatever it is, has a whole lot of meanings attached to it. So everyone knows what that means. If you're called up to level 5, then it's either really good or really not. And so on and so forth. And we tend to relate to the people we work with in our particular area. The work that we've done in law firms, we know that there is a strong affinity for legal professionals versus non-legal professionals. Working in the health sector, you have clinical versus non-clinical. You have managers versus non-managers. And while we absolutely relate to people across those dimensions, we tend to have an affinity and stick more closely to the dimensions that are more like us. And if you think about the annual company barbecue, where the sole aim of the event is to have everyone mix and mingle, what happens is everyone arrives, and the minute they see people in their own group, they gravitate towards them and have a beer. And it's a perfectly natural thing to do. And it's what psychologists call social categorization. And it's just the method where we routinely and rapidly sort people into groups rather than think of each as unique. And of course, it's a very efficient way of categorizing people. It saves us time and effort when we have to continuously process information about others. And it allows us to pay attention to other tasks or more novel information with our limited processing resources. So when there's little time, what you're going to do is you're going to default to this social categorization, and it really provides us with a very handy script of how to behave in this particular situation. And without these prejudgments, you could say, life would be very difficult, because you would, every time you went into a unique situation, you would have to learn the rules from scratch, and of course that's just untenable. We really can't operate on that basis. So we really need to understand that every time we encounter an individual or a group of individuals or a new situation, we are really running through multiple dimensions and defining ourselves and others by these dimensions. This diversity dimension wheel is not an exhaustive list of dimensions, and it's not intended to be, but it does give us a really good indication of what some of them are and how we operate around these. So, knowing now that we do define ourselves and others by some of these, I'd like to just take a look at how the brain works in this regard. And this is a very high-level view of how this looks, but it really helps us to understand the difference between fast brain and slow brain and how we operate. So if we look at the coloured portion of the brain, that's the primitive part of the brain. And it's the part of the brain that developed first. And we call this part of the brain the fast-thinking part of the brain. The piece that sits on top of that is the prefrontal area. This is the slow-thinking part of the brain, and also the part of the brain where we process information and reason and logic. This slow part of the brain allows us to think slowly and take in information and solve problems. And so the logic is that at work and in the workplace we would mostly be using the slow-thinking part of the brain. However, the two parts of the brain continuously interact with each other, and there are neurotransmitters and chemicals going backwards and forwards which switch on and off different parts of the brain. So the primitive part of the brain is where all of your predetermined viewpoints sit. So it's the part of the brain that continuously looks for potential threats, continuously scans the environment to look for what is different. And of course this was a very useful thing for primitive man. As soon as they found themselves in an environment that was a place they'd never been before, they didn't understand the variables, didn't understand what the threats might be, the primitive brain kicked in and helped them to get out of that situation safely. So what happens when the primitive brain fires up is you have what is called an amygdala hijack. And what happens is the primitive brain sends chemicals and neurotransmitters to the slow brain and says, stop working, you're not needed, this is a life and death situation. And to conserve energy, it actually switches off the thinking part of the brain. And so think about a situation where someone has been in a car accident or had something happen to them, and they said, I wasn't thinking straight, I just did A, B, and C. And in reality, that's absolutely right. Their thinking ability had literally been switched off. And the primitive brain then said, look, based on all my predetermined viewpoints, this bank of experience that I've got, this is how you ought to behave. And we behave on automatic, as it were. We do things we would never ordinarily do. We put ourselves in immense danger sometimes, and things we would never ordinarily do if we weren't in that situation. So the brain, used to be considered an organ, and of course in latter years the whole concept of neuroplasticity says that the brain actually is evolving, and the extent to which we use the different parts of the brain will dictate the extent to which those parts of the brain developed. So what we see in the workplace is that we are using both parts of the brain, but because the workplace is so stressful and so fast moving, and we're required to do everything really quickly, we're required to make quick decisions. If you look at the leadership competencies of most organizations, it's really about leading from the front, dealing with ambiguity, being able to make the right decisions fast, those sorts of things. And of course it means that we're really firing off the primitive part of the brain and not using the slower part of the brain, the logical part of the brain, as much as we could do. And that's not particularly useful, because really what we're doing is we're leveraging heavily on our biases or our predetermined viewpoint without necessarily stepping back and allowing the slow brain to actually apply some logic to that and to check in with the slow brain and say, does this bias still serve me? Does this viewpoint still serve me in this circumstance? And so when you think about the decisions you make at work, there are numerous decisions you make around hiring people, promoting, what assignments to give to which people, how to approach a particular project. We're making these decisions all the time, and we really want to be able to make these decisions based on the most current information, the most objective decision-making process that we can apply. And so it's very important that although we need to recognize that biases do serve us well, we need to make sure that we also check in with the slow brain to ensure that we are able to test that bias and see whether it's still relevant.
We have a question that's just come in, and someone has asked, how can we develop our frontal area of brain?
Well, that's very interesting. As I said, the science around neuroplasticity says that the more we use it, the more it will develop. But there was a very interesting experiment done with taxi workers in the UK, and they brought in a whole lot of they hired a bunch of taxi drivers, and they tested their brain activity with regards to spatial perception before they started their job. And a year later, they retested that group of taxi drivers, and of course the part of the brain that dealt with spatial perception had developed exponentially. And so it's really one of the tactics to overcoming biases is to recognize when you have a particular response to something, and recognize that that's your predetermined viewpoint. But then to actually give yourself the time to take in additional information and to test whether that initial response that you had is still relevant in this particular circumstance. I'll give you a really practical example, and I like to use this because I'm from Africa and I relate to this, so hopefully some of you will. But I can give you examples in the workplace as well. But if you were walking down the road and you looked up and there was a lion, your primitive brain, your fast brain, would immediately say to you, run as fast as you can. But if you had to stop and apply some slow thinking and use your prefrontal area, you would think it through and realize that, in fact, lions are cats, and cats chase. And there are a number of things that you could do that would probably give you a better chance of survival than running. Because even if the lion had recently eaten, it would probably be up for a game of chase. And so it's really about saying, which part of the brain am I using, and am I just reverting to my default position, which is my predetermined view? So if you were driving home from work today and you stopped at a traffic light and the light was green, but the green light was at the top of the traffic light, not at the bottom, you would immediately have a fast brain, slow brain reaction. Your fast brain would say, go, it's green, and your slow brain would say, no, something's wrong. The green's in the wrong place. And so, we continuously do this. If you have someone sends you an email, which is not a very good email, and you're very upset by it, if your primitive brain will immediately fire up, and you will be inclined to respond in a particular way. If you got up from your desk and went for a walk and came back and then responded, you might still be angry, but your response is likely to consider not only the short-term consequences of your reply, but also the longer-term consequences. So it's really a matter of understanding when you are firing off your own assumptions and checking in with that to make sure that it's still valid in this particular circumstance. Okay. What I'd like to do is tell you a story. And some of you might have heard the story. And I'll give you a few minutes to reflect on the story when I'm finished, and then we'll just talk through what your thinking is. So there's a father and a son who have been planning a fishing trip for a long time, and they pack up the car and say goodbye to the family, put all the gear in the fishing gear in the boot, and they set off on a 2-hour drive to their fishing spot with great excitement. Unfortunately, as they're heading off, a truck comes around the corner and smashes into the car, and unfortunately the father is killed outright, and his body is taken to the local morgue. The son is very, very badly injured, and an ambulance is called, and he's taken to the local hospital. On arriving at the hospital, he's assessed and he's in need of surgery to save his life. So he's wheeled into the theatre and the surgeon is called. And upon arrival, the surgeon looks at the boy and says, I can't operate on this boy. He's my son. Now, I just want you to think about that for a bit. It's a story that always gets very interesting responses. For most of us, we will revert immediately to Fast Brain. And Fast Brain says, how can that be? The father was killed in the car accident. And for many, many people that we tell the story to in our workshop training, they will sit there and scratch their heads and get stuck on that point. And of course, they'll start to unpack the accident or start to look back at the other details of the story because they're unable to move past the fact that the father was killed in the accident. For many of us, our default position, our Fast Brain default position is to go, how can that be? The father was killed. And then some of us are immediately able to recalibrate our thinking, to apply slow brain thinking and go, hang on, okay, but the son has two parents, so the mother is the surgeon. And then for others of us, we are able to go straight to the mother is the surgeon. And it seems really, really obvious to us. But the vast majority of people have to revert from fast brain to slow brain to get the answer. And that's an example of a very deep-seated bias, an unconscious bias that associates men with being surgeons. Now, if we had to poll you when we started this webinar and said, do you believe that all surgeons are male? You would all have come back and said, that's a ridiculous notion. Of course not. But consciously you know that, but subconsciously that's not how your brain's thinking. And of course you can say, well, why does it matter? Well, it matters because whatever your perceptions are drive your behaviors towards that person or situation. So that's an example of slow brain, fast brain thinking. And so we have to say, well, this is all very interesting, but why does it matter in the workplace? What's happening in the workplace? Well, the world of work is changing. And where we've come from, and you can see by the slide we've got up there, is we've come from, in the early 1930s, 40s, and right up until the 80s, the workplace was much more homogenous in terms of the demographic. And this is, of course, a very westernized picture. But predominantly, workers were male, and there was one way of working, which was full-time permanent. And there were very many theories written about workers and what they were and how to motivate them and so forth. But the prevailing view was that, workers were there to do their job. You had to motivate them through a series of punishments if they didn't work. And certainly diversity wasn't something that was valued in the workplace. Back in the day, groupthink was probably the gold standard. So it was really about organizations being much more hierarchical, and the extent to which you were able to take direction from the top down and to execute the wishes of the boss was the extent to which you were a good employee. And so back in those times, people were primarily hired on the basis of their IQ. And for those of us who've been working for long enough and been around a long time, we are very familiar with the fact that even at school, we were tested on our IQ. Every year we had IQ tests because IQ really was the method of assessing ability. Of course, as organizations have changed and as the world has changed, we have grown up and realized that it's not just IQ that matters, it's not just intelligence, but in fact it is also EQ. And EQ really is our ability to work with others. So this whole notion that not only do you have to be good at your job, but you also have to be able to work with others and collaborate with others in some shape or form. And that's where this whole notion of EQ was born. And think about the medical profession, where, in medical schools today, there's a strong focus on EQ. There's a strong focus on bedside manner, which many, many years ago, of course, didn't exist. And now with the world of work changing and with all of this diversity coming into the workplace, we have this notion of CQ, where we have to work with people, with other people, but we also have to work with others who are completely different to us, who have a completely different worldview, who approach things completely differently. And this is the whole notion of CQ. So when we look at how organizations are evolving, And this is just a neat chart to call out some of the dimensions or some of the values that organizations had in the 20th century versus the 21st century. But you can see that this top-down hierarchical approach is really giving way to much more of a shared purpose. And of course, being shared, it means we need to get people to buy in. And that, of course, really is dictated by how inclusive we are. And so organizations are much more collaborative. People are much more consultative in how things get done. And we really are starting to see a whole melting pot of people coming into the workplace with different ideas and looking at ways that they can collaborate and add value as individuals. And we see this in a really pronounced way in New Zealand, but it is happening globally. So some of the ways in which the New Zealand workforce is changing are around obviously growing ethnic diversity, and we see that it's very marked no matter where you go. But this obviously has profound implications in terms of language and just approach to work and bringing in cultural norms into the workplace. And so these very strong dominant in-groups that we've had in organizations for a very long time are being challenged. And of course, this can be a liability in organizations. So a lot of people talk about diversity and how wonderful it is. Well, in reality, diversity on its own can be a massive challenge to organizations because it's akin to putting a whole lot of people in a room who are completely different and asking them to solve a problem. And of course, this doesn't always work out well. So diversity on its own is, while it is a huge opportunity for New Zealand organizations, it is also presenting a challenge in terms of how do we create an environment where we can leverage the difference that is brought in and we can make it work for us. Many organizations today are still they're hiring for diversity because theoretically we understand that's a good thing, but we are still training for sameness. And we really need to think through what does that mean for our organizations. So growing ethnicity means that it's an opportunity for New Zealand's workforce to continue to grow. Although our growth is slowing down, it is the reason why New Zealand's workforce has shown growth over recent years. And we know that the Asian population is predicted to grow by 145% by 2021 rather, and Pacifica by 59%, Maori by 29%, and the European workforce only by 5%. And if we overlay age across this dimension, then we can also notice that the European segment is much older than the other groups that I've referred to. And so this also plays out in terms of age in the organization. So we have, in most organizations, we have 3 or 4 generations working for the first time. And as the population is aging, of course, people are staying in work for a much longer period of time. In New Zealand, we don't have a retirement age, which is fantastic. And so in terms of where we sit in the OECD, is we're second only to Iceland in terms of our participation for older workers. So what this means is, if I say to you, close your eyes and picture what an apprentice looks like, you probably are seeing a young male. But what's really happening is we're seeing older women coming back into the workforce who have been out of the workforce for maybe 20 years, 25 years, and they're coming back into the workforce driven by economic necessity, but also the desire to contribute, because if I'm going to be living for so much longer, then I want to contribute for longer. But they're coming in as apprentices. Similarly, when we talk about graduates, we picture a graduate, we picture a young person. But we're seeing organizations taking in graduates who are in their 50s, people who have left whatever profession they were in and have retrained in some or another area and are re-entering the workforce. And this is a tremendous opportunity for New Zealand. But it does change the paradigm. It does change how we think about this. And of course, if we perceive graduates as being in their 20s, and that's the picture of what we see, then we are going to have a bias against anyone who looks differently. Whether it's conscious or unconscious, we need to understand that we need to look at it differently. So the last sort of mega trend that I want to call out is flexible work design. And this is something that is happening globally, the deregulation of the workforce. And what it really means is, whereas in the 1930s and 40s there was one way of working, which was permanent full-time employee in the office, we are seeing many, many variations of how people work. And work is becoming to be viewed as a thing you do, not a place you go. And that has fundamental implications for us. We did research on this in 2015 when the new legislation was passed around flexible work, the Amendment Act, and we wanted to understand what the impact was in New Zealand workplaces. So we canvassed opinion from across New Zealand employers, thousands and thousands of employees, and we found that the vast majority of them are either working or want to work flexibly or will be looking to work flexibly in the future. And the interesting thing about this is that it cut across all of those dimensions. It cut across industry, it cut across gender, it cut across age. So it's the one common denominator across all workers. And of course the different cohorts in the workforce want flexibility for different reasons, but nevertheless they're looking for better work-life balance. So very, very interesting. A full 63%, I think it was, of workers who we canvassed said that they would leave their current employer for an equivalent role, which was on a flexible basis. So think about that. It's not for promotion. It's not for better pay. It's not for a different title. But it's for flexibility. And so what we see is that many of the flexible workers today are also underemployed. And what we mean by that is they are employed in roles which are below their capability, because what they've done is trade off their ability for flexibility. So we really have to address this. There's so much work going on around improving flexibility for women in the workplace, but we have to equally give focus to men, because women are still the predominant carers in New Zealand, and until we address the fact that women are having to provide caring responsibilities as well as employment, we need to spread the load, and that really is how we can mainstream flexible work in our organisations. So having said that, New Zealand is still doing pretty well relative to the OECD, but of course we have an opportunity to really focus on this area and really boost our employment participation rates. We do a lot of work with Carers New Zealand, and many employees fall out of work because they can't manage their caring responsibilities and their work. And it's it's very, very bad for the economy. So we really need to look at how we can do this. And of course technology has a big role to play in enabling this. But interestingly enough, it's not technology generally that holds it up. It's really the perception of managers, this whole notion of presenteeism. So important to understand with flexible work is, even though employees know that they are eligible to apply for flexible work, many of them don't, because there is perception that there will be a sting in the tail. And there very often is a sting in the tail, in the sense that it is career retarding for many people, for many women, and for many men it is tantamount to career suicide. So we see men taking time off to look after their family and have flexibility on that basis, and then when they try to re-enter, it's very, very difficult for them. So, we have organizational issues and societal issues to address, and that, of course, cannot be driven just by legislation. That has to be driven by our own behaviors, our own biases, and how they play out in that arena. And, having done a lot of work across organizations, we really believe that work design is probably the biggest opportunity we have in New Zealand in terms of addressing biases. All right, so we do need to care about this stuff. It is not, yes, there is a societal reason. Yes, there is social responsibility and all of that good stuff. But as from an organizational perspective, and that's the focus that we at Diversitas have, it is really a massive opportunity for us to be more productive and to grow the economy. And this is why we need to care. So coming back to the fact that diversity is everywhere, and we often hear organizations say, look how diverse we are, isn't it great? And yes, it is. But you're probably diverse by default, which means that you've been drawing on the talent pool that's been made available to you for many years, and the net result of that is that you have people in your organization who come from different places and speak different languages, and that's fantastic. But diversity is a fact, and it will continue to become more diverse in our workplaces, whether we overtly focus on it or not. The challenge we have is, how do we create this inclusive work environment? How do we create this culture that helps us to intentionally and actively engage with this workforce? Because we know from research, if we can get this right, we can have better innovation, and we can have better problem solving. And certainly we can reduce the level of conflict in our organizations, but also we have an opportunity to reach an external customer base that we might not be able to reach now. So the opportunities are vast, but it boils down to inclusiveness and behaviors, and of course our behaviors are directly impacted by our own biases. So when you talk about organizational culture, and we often have this, we hear this in recruitment exercises, we didn't hire this person because they didn't fit the culture. And we really have to re-examine what we mean by that. Do we mean my own culture, or do we mean the wider organizational culture? And if we, on the one hand, value diversity, then can we just proceed on the basis that we have one culture? What does that really mean? Because really, if diversity is something we're aiming for, then should we not have different cultures in the organization? Should we not be able to look at things very differently and, have executive teams that have different skills and look at things differently and have different styles and have different skill sets? And then collectively say that is our culture. Our culture is to be diverse. So we've really got to think about what that looks like in our organizations. And it is a big challenge because it is not something that we are hardwired to do. So if we go back and think about how we define ourselves and others, and our primitive brain continuously scanning the environment for what is different and calling that out as a threat, then it is not our natural inclination to bond with what is different. And it's something that you have to be really overt about if you're going to overcome that, because you will default to your human condition, which is to refer to that affinity bias. And it's nothing more than if it sounds like me and if it looks like me and if it has the same characteristics, then it is a good thing. And, of course, the opposite also applies. So if we don't address this in organizations, what we have is this whole concept of in-group and out-group behavior. And it's just a form of social categorization. But it's a very well-known principle in social psychology that we define ourselves in terms of these social groupings, and we're quick to denigrate others who don't fit into our group. And sometimes these lines are quite arbitrary, the dimensions by which we form these associations. But we nevertheless hear language in organizations like, don't take this to HR, they will never sign it off. And as soon as you've got a they, you're assigning those homogeneous characteristics. You're seeing members of that group as just one homogeneous blob. You're not calling out their differences. Excuse me. And what happens is that is the out group for you in that particular circumstance. So we all belong to in-groups and out-groups in our workplaces and from a societal point of view. And how we know when we're in an out-group is we feel distinctly uncomfortable. We might feel anxious. We might feel like we don't belong. We might feel like something is just not quite right with the situation. And I think we've all had those experiences where we walk into a meeting and we might do a presentation and we just feel like we did what we said we would do, but it just didn't feel good. Or we were bidding for a piece of work and we came away and we said, gosh, it didn't feel good. And what happens is you're picking up cues from body language, from what is said, from what is unsaid, from the way people are facing you or not facing you, how much time people have given you, how much time you had to wait to go into the presentation. And you're picking up all these cues and you just don't feel comfortable. And in that scenario, you were probably in an out group and it doesn't feel good. Conversely, if you're in an in group, you probably don't even know that there is a group. You just feel good. So we often hear this, especially when we do work in organizations and look at the perceptions of individuals, of employees. And employees will come back to us and say, look, there's a massive old boys club or whatever at the top. And then when we speak to the old boys, they're really shocked and horrified because they don't see themselves that way. And they're doing everything they can to dispel that myth. But of course, it's a perception. And so it's really important to understand that biases exist within groups and with people in the out group. And one is not more correct than the other. That both of them are just perceptions. But of course, perception is reality when it comes to how we behave. And so it's really important to understand that these dynamics play out. And it really is about us being much more observant about what is really going on in a particular interaction. So our human tendency really is when we get into an uncomfortable situation, we tend to want to remove ourselves as quickly as possible. But one of the strategies for overcoming bias is to just sit in that circumstance for a while and to really think about what is going on, what's playing out. So that you can understand the dynamic. Because inevitably there's a power dynamic happening. And for you to understand how you can overcome your own biases or how you can intervene to create a more inclusive outcome, you really need to understand what's going on. And likewise, for people in the in-group, they need to understand that not everyone experiences the world the way they do. And if you think about when you were at school and there were the cool kids and there were the not so cool kids. It's a very good example of an in-group, out-group. And, you go to the same school, attend the same lessons, have the same teachers, but the experience for one child can be vastly different to the experience of another child. And we're often shocked and horrified when, children behave in a way that we don't expect because they felt excluded for such a long time. But it's a very, very powerful power dynamic playing out. And, it really undermines our ability to be inclusive. And the more diverse our workforce is, the more minority groups we have in the workforce, the more this tendency will play out. And we need to be really, really aware of how it is, how it's playing out for people who perceive themselves as minorities in that particular circumstance. So the challenge really is to think about in your own environment what in-groups and out-groups you belong to. And as I said, the lines are quite arbitrary. You might have someone in your organization who lands a major deal. They've been with your firm for 10 years and they've been an okay performer. And all of a sudden they land a big deal, a big legal contract for you. And for this person, they've suddenly been catapulted into the in-group. And the senior partners are making eye contact, they're calling them in, they're meeting with them, and it just feels very, very good. And for that moment, the person has a completely different experience of being there. And then a month later, somebody else lands an even bigger deal, and that person is catapulted back into the out group. So not easy to identify, but once we've identified what those in-groups and out-groups look like, we can then start to address some of our own behaviors towards people in those minority groups to create a more inclusive environment. So learning about our own biases is just a constant process, and as long as you are alive, you will be forming biases. Some of them will be conscious, some of them will be unconscious. And it's important to understand that it's just an ongoing human condition. So how do we actually then, in our workplaces and from a societal point of view, how do we start to become more objective, and how do we start to create an environment that is more inclusive? Well, learning about how to overcome our own biases is really like learning a new language. And we have here this conscious competence learning matrix. And I'm sure many of you have seen this before, but it's just a useful model to think about this. So you start off at the top left-hand corner, and where you're unconscious of your incompetence around unconscious bias. It's a mouthful. So you don't know that you have any biases, and you don't know that they matter. And you completely lack in any proficiency. So the first step towards overcoming unconscious bias is to make those biases conscious, is to bring them to your consciousness. And the way we do this is to understand how we respond or react to a particular situation or a particular individual. So I'll give you a key example. You are trying to hire for a legal role, and you've got a whole lot of candidates coming in to see you, and your next candidate is 10 minutes late, and they arrive and you don't like the way they're dressed, and you immediately have a negative perception about them. What happens is that the minute you have decided whether you have this positive or negative perception, you will be looking for information that reinforces your already held bias. And so what happens is that you sit down and you interview this person, but you're more likely to cut the interview short because you have already decided before you started interviewing them that they're not suitable. And what happens is that you continue then during that interview process to look for negative information, to look for information that confirms your bias. And so by default, you don't look for information that contradicts your bias. So you completely lack any proficiency in saying, okay, I recognize that I feel negative towards this individual, so now I'm going to put some strategies in place to help me check in to see whether this bias is valid. And it may very well be that once you've checked in, it is valid. But you have done an objective sense test to make sure that that is the case. So let's just say at this point you're completely unaware of your lack of proficiency. Then you go on training, or you read up about it, or you do some learning, and you move into the level of conscious incompetence. So at this point, I'm aware that I probably do have predetermined viewpoints about people, and that I do make snap judgments based on social categorization. That's sort of first impression judgment. But I'm not yet proficient in being able to overcome it. And so I start to apply some of the strategies that we're going to talk about in a little while, and I start to apply that to the situation. And what I find is that I can move then into that conscious competence. So I'm able to use the skill, but I have to do it with a whole lot of effort. And for most of us, this is probably where we will land with regards to overcoming unconscious bias, because it's very, very difficult to move into the next level, which is it becomes so innate to us, like learning a language, that we don't even have to think about it. It's certainly not my experience that I've ever been able to get to that point. It really is about saying, look, I recognize that my first response to a particular person or a situation or whatever I'm confronted with is negative. So now I'm going to put some strategies in place to check that. Or quite likely, you might find that you have the opposite, that you have a very positive first impression, and that once you've determine that you have 2 or 3 things in common with a person, you immediately jump to the conclusion that this person is going to be fantastic for your organization, or you immediately favor that person, and you really haven't actually looked for any information that contradicts that assumption. So it can play out in a positive way for some people and a negative way for others. So it really is about constantly and overtly applying some of these strategies. And the strategies are really designed to take what is unconscious, make it conscious, and then apply slow brain thinking to check in and say, look, I recognize that this is the way I feel. And right, you don't judge it. It's not right or wrong. It's just the way you feel. And now I'm going to check in and see what other information do I need to know to be able to test this assumption. So let's have a look at some of these individual strategies. And of course, this is not an exhaustive list either, but these are some of the things that really seem to help to bring it from the subconscious level to the conscious level and help us to learn about ourselves. And I guess that's really, really important. It's going on an exploratory venture where you are learning about yourself in a way that you probably haven't been aware before. And we always say to people, once you know this material and once you've experienced it for yourself, you can't unknow it, but you can choose to do nothing about it. So that is an individual choice. So the first point to acknowledge is that we all have biases. And as I said, it's part of the human condition. It is not something that should be demonized, as it very often is. And you can't train people out of their unconscious biases. Well, you can, but only if they're no longer alive. Because once you're no longer alive, you're not developing any of those biases. But we all have them, and you will be, in every situation that you are confronted with today and for the rest of your life, you will be forming those biases. So make friends with it. It is normal. It's what you need to do. And it helps you to navigate through life. What you do need to learn to recognize is your own biases. And what I call out here really is learn to recognize your conscious biases first. So very often we come across the fact that roles are over-credentialized. They ask for skills that actually are not necessary in the role. And that's a conscious bias. Have a look at your workplace. Have a look at the decision points that you make. And have a look at where you are actually making conscious decisions. You have conscious biases around certain criteria, and really sense check those criteria. Make sure that it actually works for you. Make sure that it is still relevant in a workplace which apparently values diversity. Be really clear on how you translate that philosophical statement into how you run your business. To overcome your unconscious bias, you really need to, first of all, understand how you feel in a situation, and then you need to behave in that situation as if there is no bias. So our example about the chap coming in or the lady coming in for an interview who arrived late and you have this negative bias, okay? If you were to consciously act as if there were no bias, you would do a full interview with that person, and during that interview, you would look for information that contradicted your bias. You don't have to look for information that confirms your bias because it will come flying at you in all directions. What you need to look for is additional information to test that bias. So in all of those circumstances, if you're in an uncomfortable position, you walked into a meeting and you feel like you're in the out group, you need to consciously act as if there is no bias, because you will learn what your bias is by doing that. We need to slow down and adopt slow thinking. And when we talk about slow brain, fast brain, we're not talking about paralyzing decision making in your organization. The slow brain is extremely fast. So we're talking about a couple of split-second decisions versus the fast brain, which of course is even faster. But it isn't about slowing down decision making. It's really about understanding What do you need to know? What else do you need to know? And of course, it is just a basic principle of good decision making. We need to not value the person who can make the decision the quickest. Because while it is a quick decision, it's a decision based on very limited information. And so we need to know what that cutoff point is. When do we stop looking for additional information? But in order to overcome our unconscious biases, we need to err on the side of looking for more information. So try not to make decisions on the fly. One CFO who came to our workshop said that after the training, he stopped signing things off in the passage. So he would be walking down the corridor at work, and someone would come up to him and say, "Can you just sign this off?" And because he trusted the individual, because they've been working there for 10 years, he thought nothing of it. And he realized that he wasn't doing justice to that individual or to himself. And so he made a philosophical decision to never sign anything off on the fly. And even if it's about taking 5 minutes to have a discussion with the individual and sitting down with them and finding out more information, that's what he now does, and he believes he makes better decisions based on that. So it's just one small example of how you can adopt slow thinking. But many examples of being able to, ask other people for their opinion. At least ask people how they see it. It takes a few seconds to do that, but it could be invaluable in terms of feeding into your decision making. So most of us are not in life and death situations. Most of us are not saving lives. We are doing deals, which is quite different. And to be able to slow down and make the best decisions for those deals, I don't think anyone can argue with that. It's very important as well to recognize that you will, in the absence of looking for additional information or in the absence of actually inquiring and asking the questions you need to ask, you will fill in the blanks with your own assumptions. So one of the things our primitive brain doesn't like is gaps. So our brain doesn't like to have voids of knowledge. And so if we don't know, we will fill our knowledge with our own assumptions. And I know this sounds bizarre, but you meet a person for the first time and you size them up, generally based on their external dimensions, so things that they can't help, like their gender and their age and so forth. And immediately you've done that, your brain will assign a whole lot of assumptions about this person. And so you will feel like you know this person. You will feel like you have a handle on who this person is. And you may only be 10% correct. You may be, in fact, wildly out with regards to who these people are. And, there's many, many exercises you can do sitting down with your colleagues and testing this theory. And we do this with people who've worked together for 20 years. And we ask them, did you learn something about your colleague? And they say, absolutely. And did you learn something that surprised you? Absolutely. So in the absence of doing the work to actually find out what we need to know and stopping to question people and filling in the blanks with real information, we will just let our primitive brain do it for us, and we will genuinely believe that we know all it is we need to know about that person. So one of the key ways in which we can do this is to ask the right questions. And it sounds terribly obvious. But, you hear people coming out of an hour-long interview or sometimes a 2-hour interview, and you'll say to the hiring manager, so are you going to hire them or not? Are they a good fit? And they'll go, I really don't know. And you have to ask, why do you not know? And generally it comes down to the fact that probably the interview wasn't constructed very well, but more than likely we didn't ask the right questions. Okay, we didn't actually ask questions that that really give us the information we need to be able to make this decision. And once again, in whatever situation you're in, your own biases will come flying at you. So you really need to look for information that contradicts your perception. So if your person's arrived late for an interview and they don't look the part, you will then give them a full interview and look for information that says, look, I'm trustworthy, I can be relied upon, I'm a good fit for your organization. If you look for that information and you still don't find it, well, you can, safely make your decision. But of course, if you're not looking for that information in the first place and you make your decision, well, you might have missed out on a great opportunity. And of course, the contrary is also true when it's, they've made a positive first impression and you're looking for information that contradicts that. So it's just a really good acid test. Another really good strategy is to take time to gather additional information, even if you think you know what you need to know. Because we will always default to that. Because we fill in the blanks with our own assumptions, we will default to that position. We will go, no, we think we already know. We've been in the situation before. And that's not always a conscious thought. So, we hear people say, well, once I hired an older person and it didn't work out, so the instruction to the recruitment companies, don't send me any older CVs. Don't send me people who are older because they don't fit our culture. And that's because the perception is I've been here before and I know how this goes. So I don't need to take time to gather additional information. And in fact you do, because the circumstances of that scenario would have been fundamentally different to what you are facing now. Because obviously that's life. No two circumstances are the same. And then finally, to make an effort to mix with people who are different from you. And when you do, focus on what you have in common. So this is much more difficult than it sounds, because our natural tendency, social categorization, is to gravitate towards people who are the same as us. So if you go to an industry function, and you walk into the room and there are, 100 people in the room and you don't know any of them. Let's hypothetically say you don't know. Who do you gravitate towards? Have you ever thought about that? So more than likely, you will gravitate towards people who, according to your own perception, you define as very similar to yourself in those social categories. So in my example, years ago, when I went into an industry function, I would head straight for the middle-aged white woman who looks friendly. And I know you can't see what I look like, but you're just going to have to take my word for it. That's what I look like. And so I would be very, it was a completely subconscious thing that I did. And basically I was looking at where could I fit in and where would I not be rejected and where could I have an enjoyable conversation. What I do now, and what I've done for many years, is I do exactly the opposite. So I scan the room and look for the person I'm least likely to want to engage with. And that takes a very conscious effort, because as I'm walking towards the person who is nothing like me, everything in my fiber is saying turn around and walk towards the person who is. But the fascinating thing is when you do this, what happens is you are dispelling your biases. The minute you connect with that person who is different from you and you focus on what you have in common, and inevitably you will have far more in common than what you first realized. In the first instance, you're at the same function, so clearly there's an industry link at the very least. But what happens is that you dispel so many of your own biases by doing that. And of course it's a very interesting thing to do, but it also really highlights what your own biases are. You become super aware of who you gravitate away from and who you gravitate towards. And it really enriches your understanding of how other people work and operate and how they see it. And it's something that within our own workplaces we're going to have to consciously do if we are going to create this much more inclusive environment. So those are a number of strategies that you can employ, and of course there are very many more. And I encourage you to read through the workbooks, and there is a lot of information online around fast brain and slow brain thinking, and strategies on how to overcome bias and so forth. So I encourage you to go on a journey and to think about this more consciously. And really, I think it is our individual responsibility as workers in New Zealand and as employees of organisations, I mean, we collectively build the culture of our organisation. And the time for top-down organisational culture building has long since passed. And it really comes down to us as individuals deciding on what sort of organisations we build and how competitive we can really become with regards to the diversity of our workforce. And that is, after all, as business people, aside from all of the other social responsibilities we have and moral obligations, as business people, if we can get this right, we can not only build our own organisations, but we can build the economy of New Zealand and be really competitive on the world stage. So, thank you for your time.
Oh, thank you. Actually, I'm going to echo a sentiment that's just come through. Somebody has commented and said this has been amazingly insightful. Thank you. And I'm going to echo that as well, because I think you described me at that cocktail party there as well. And I will now try and actually, integrate and move around slightly more. Okay, we've got a number of questions that have come through. So I'm going to start from the beginning and just work our way through. They'll be in some order, but often decisions in the workplace need to be taken rapidly, with little or no time to consider the impact of biases. How can one overcome their biases in these circumstances?
Yeah, so it comes down to, I guess, the sort of fast brain, slow brain thinking. I think that we default to fast brain way too quickly. Unless you're in a life or death situation, I think, taking another half an hour to gather information, or even longer if you need to, really improves the quality of that decision. And there are a number of ways that you can do that. I think even if you don't consult anyone else, even if you don't do further research, if you just in the first instance recognize what your own bias is and recognize that you will be filtering, you will be looking at information that confirms your bias, and you'll be filtering out everything else. So whatever the basis is of your research for that conversation, recognize what your bias is, and then go back and reread or redo your research, but look for information that contradicts your initial perception. And if you only do that, I believe you will have a better quality decision. You can obviously then also, by consulting others and by testing your perception with others and saying, look, this is how I see it, how do you see it? And even taking the time to do that will even further improve your decision making. And as I said, you may come back to your original decision. Your original decision may be it's a good deal, and that was your bias. That was the first sort of answer you got from your bias, and that's great. But at least you've done some objective testing.
Now, an area that's brought up a lot of questions, so I'll try and condense them. Do you think there is sometimes an unconscious bias against those who have flexible working arrangements? And if so, is this related to gender bias, given that it is often women who have flexible work arrangements, or a bias regardless of gender? And what can be done about it? Then there's a follow-up question of, are you getting any traction with employers moving towards trying to tap this undervalued talent pool, which want flexibility? And then a comment, it seems it will take a generation for this to change.
Oh, great questions. Let me address the gender bias versus work design bias. So in many of the organizations we've worked with, and this is public and private sector, there is a perception of gender bias. And we often get called in to say, look, we think there's gender bias. Can you help us uncover what's going on? And sometimes there is, in fact, there always is an element of gender bias. But when it comes to the real crux of the problem, we very, very often find it's actually a work design bias. And what I mean by that is people who work flexibly, whether they are male or female, are prejudiced. And it's an unconscious bias. So how it plays out in organizations is people who are not in the office full-time are given less interesting work. And the reason this happens is they're just not there. Okay, so when you're having a meeting and you're talking about something that's just come in, or you're talking about an opportunity that a client's presented, if the person is not in front of you or easily accessed because face-to-face, because they happen to be working remotely, you're less likely to have the conversation with them, and they're less likely to be in the loop. And so when it comes to allocating the work, they're less likely to be considered. Similarly, when it comes to performance ratings and performance evaluations, the unconscious bias is, if I can see what you're doing and you seem to be working hard, you're bent over your desk and you seem to be working hard, then my unconscious perception is that you are working hard and I'm going to give you a good rating. But as soon as you are remote from me, I actually can't see what you're doing. Even though, I understand that I'm managing on outputs and I'm sort of managing you on the basis of the work that you're delivering, I still can't see you. And so my unconscious says the person I can see is working harder than the person I can't see. And so it plays out across gender because predominantly in our workplaces, women are the people who take up flexible work. But it plays out equally for men. And this is really, really important. So the sting in the tail with regards to flexible work has an equal sting for men. But because women are the predominant uptakers of flexible work, it is perceived as a gender bias. Now, the way organizations are starting to address it, and this is how we recommend organizations really get to the root cause, because there's so many assumptions we make about what's happening in our organizations. You really need to look at the data. You need to do the analytics and look at the data and look at how it's playing out. So for you to address that, you really need to look at what are the performance ratings in the last 6 months for people who work flexibly versus people who don't. What are the performance ratings for people who've got high performance ratings but who were then not promoted? What does the data look like? And as soon as you uncover the data, you can start to address it overtly, because you have to address it overtly, otherwise you will never, make a change. So it's, unfortunately, there isn't one size fits all. You really need to know what your own organization looks like, and you need to do the diagnostic to understand that. Because it's very dangerous to make an assumption that there is a gender bias or an age bias. And in reality, that's just theory. The question is, how does it play out and how is it impacting your organization? You need to get to that granular level to have interventions to address it.
Okay, a follow-up question then. Are there any standout organizations in the world that are ahead of the field in terms of diversity and flexibility?
Gosh, this
is a biased question.
It's a very interesting question. The statistics we have in organizations are the number of people who have taken up flexible work. And the organizations that have the highest statistics in this regard tend to be viewed as the standout organizations. But that really is a very peripheral view of what is going on in the organization. Sometimes when you dig further down into those organizations, there is a lot of bias going on, and people who work flexibly are severely prejudiced. So while the numbers are up, it's not necessarily a happy place to work. And what you also find is that there's a lot of turnover in those organizations. And then the second issue is what is meant by flexible work. So it's a very, very broad term. So, when we do diagnostics in organizations and they say, 50% of our people work flexibly, and we go, wow, that's awesome. What organizations mean is within a 40-hour week, sometimes people will come in at 8 o'clock and leave at 5, and other days they'll come in at 7 and leave at 3, and they call that flexible work. And of course that is not how we define flexible work. So there isn't a vanilla definition, and so the stats are very untrustworthy. And it isn't really an issue of quantity. It is much more an issue of quality. So you could have a whole, 50% of your workforce could be working flexibly, but 30% of those people could be underemployed. In other words, employed in jobs that are below their ability. How is that good for productivity? So once again, not an easy vanilla answer.
No. Okay, now something else that's coming through again. If you're in an out group at work, how do you address this issue to those in the in group with the bias if they haven't gone through this training?
Really difficult to do. When we do this training, we do the theory and we do a whole lot of exercises. And the exercises that we do are the transformational bit. And until people have had an epiphany for themselves, so you can give people theory and say, look, in organizations we have in-groups and out-groups. But until people actually have an epiphany for themselves and understand their role and where they fit, because inevitably people fit into both categories. So you know what in-groups you're in and you know what out-groups you're in. But if you haven't done the training, or you haven't at least been skilled up to understand what this is all about, it's extremely difficult. However, I don't think it's a reason not to call it out. I think there is always an opportunity to call it out and say, look, for you, this is how you are experiencing this particular issue, but what you need to understand is for us, or for this person, or for this minority group, this is how they're experiencing that. What can we do to make their experience different? So it's really about every day in your work environment, calling out situations where you think there is a power imbalance, or where you think that people are feeling uncomfortable or less than included. So we don't have to throw the book at people or get them to study the theory, but I think it's really about just calling out that the fact that with the diversity of the workforce you have, people experience things differently and see things differently. And it often plays out in humour in organisations. This whole concept of we're an organisation with a sense of humour, and if you don't like our sense of humour, you shouldn't be here. Well, it's a very, very tricky topic, because you've got a real diversity of cultures, and what is acceptable humour now. On the one hand, you want to be diverse, but on the other hand, you want to have humour that pertains to only one group. How does that work? So very tricky to deal with, but I think that things need to be dealt with at the time that they occur. It's the most impactful way of dealing with things, is calling it out and saying, thank you for telling me how you see it, Mr. Manager, but I'm just curious as to whether Susan sees it the same way. And, if you have those sorts of conversations, you have champions in the organization, you will soon start to see some behaviors change. People realize, oh, there is a different way of seeing it.
I'm just going to jump back slightly. Somebody's written and said, how do you define flexible work? Because I think we defined what it wasn't. But
yeah, so of course it's defined in many ways. For purposes of the research that we did in 2015, we wanted to look at formal flexible work. And the way we defined formal flexible work was flexible work that was documented in an organization. In other words, something was written down to formalize the arrangement, whether it was in a contract or whether it was some separate agreement. And it was work that it was a variation of where people worked and their hours of work. So a variation on the 40-hour work week in an organization, and an arrangement that was for 6 months or longer. So, in other words, a semi-permanent arrangement that was a way of being, and it was a real variation on the 40 hours or the location. So, as opposed to just agility within the 40 hours.
Can a bias ever be both logical and justified, or are biases by definition always a bad thing?
No, not at all. So biases are extremely useful. And of course, you couldn't get rid of them if you tried. So, you may as well use your bias. And biases are extremely useful because they tell you initially what your gut feel is. And I don't know what the stats are, but every now and again, purely relying on your bias will be fine. It'll be fine. 1 in 10 times your decision will be right. But in reality, a bias is just a starting point. And if you can just view it, it's not wrong, but it's a starting point. It's not the end. So once you understand what your bias is, you can then check in. Check in with the facts and see whether it still stacks up. So always start with your bias. But if you don't check in and don't look for information that contradicts that, you're probably not going to get the full picture. And so it's the package deal that really promotes the most objective decision making.
Now, question. Statement first. I think as a profession we have a lot of work to do to overcome our biases and develop a more diverse workforce. Do you have any insights as to whether the financial performance of a business is linked to the diversity of its workforce?
Yeah, very interesting question. So there's been quite a lot of research done by McKinsey and Catalyst and other organizations where they have found there's a correlation between both gender and ethnic diversity on boards and at senior levels. There's a correlation between diversity there. and profitability of the organization. So EBIT and so forth. But, of course, no one's ever been able to prove causation, and I doubt whether anyone ever would. I think we have to sort of rely on our intuition here and say, if I'm working for an organization and I feel valued, I see other people like me, I have role models, I feel like my differences are noted and not just tolerated, but, as I said, valued, then I'm likely to be more engaged, I'm likely to give more of my discretionary effort, and I'm likely to do better at my job. So this research is very interesting because as soon as you have a skew one way or the other, so they tested organizations that had predominantly male boards, and their performance. And then they tested organizations that had predominantly female boards and their performance. And what they found is that it is actually the blend. It doesn't have to be 50-50, but it has to be a more or less equitable blend across the group. Those are the organizations who actually perform the best. So, no causation, but a high degree of correlation. And I'm looking forward to the day when someone with a research hat can actually show causation. But I think instinctively we know as individuals what drives our own engagement and discretionary effort. And that's where we feel we belong and we're valued.
Well, I'm just going to do one last question. What do you look for when trying to find someone who is unlike you? How do you identify the characteristics which are most unlike you?
Oh, that's a really good question too. Look, I think the way to start is with those external dimensions of diversity. So, rightly or wrongly, that first impression with people is always based on their gender, their age, their physical appearance, their skin color. It's what you look like. Okay, those are the things that you judge a person by immediately, because those are the things that are immediately apparent. And, when you're in that sort of group situation, of course, that's all you have to go on. So in my own case, I will go for someone who looks incredibly unlike me, and whatever that is. I don't have to get into detail because that would be embarrassing. But you would look at, the physical characteristics, and even someone who maybe didn't make eye contact with you and didn't smile at you, all of the things that you would normally go for. And I promise you will find the person in the room. It's an exercise. It's actually a really fun exercise to do. But when you look around the room, you will immediately notice that person. You won't immediately know why it is they're the person you're least likely to be attracted to. But when you sit there or stand there and look at them for a while and look at them in terms of their external dimensions, you will start to understand what those dimensions are. And that in itself creates a bit of an epiphany. Because when you think about it, you realize that actually that is the type of person you most often avoid. Whatever that type means to you. So it's an incredibly individual thing. But that's what you tend to go on. We place a lot of merit on what people look like.
Well, unfortunately, our time for questions has now finished. Thank you to everyone for your attendance today and for the questions sent in, and thank you in particular, Carol, for this interesting and extremely topical presentation. Now, you can access an archived copy of the presentation by logging onto MyCPD. Further instructions on how to do that will be emailed to you later today. The same email will also give you an electronic certificate of attendance for your CPD records and a link to an online evaluation. We'd really appreciate it if you could take a couple of minutes to complete that evaluation to let us know what you thought of today's webinar. This webinar has now concluded.